I've already made a few comments about comparing some of these approaches. I guess I did a sort of an incoherent throwaway line about net present value versus internal rate of return at the end of part E. So let's talk about this a little bit more explicitly and briefly consider which method should we use. I mean, I think it's clear that the time value of money methods are more useful. They're even better than payback, because payback basically ignores cash flows outside a certain window, the recovery or the payback window. Whereas NPV, net present value and internal rate of return, consider all cash flows, but they consider them in a different way. So it's useful to consider how these two compare. Let's assume your company's okay at borrowing, doesn't have a problem, wants to take an investment. In the following table, we've got 3 projects that are going to give you different answers depending on whether you look at net present value, using net present value, or using internal rate of return. So let's have a look at the numbers. For each of the projects, we've got an outflow at the beginning, some shops, some units. So they're the things that we can potentially invest in. And they're giving us the cash flows in years 1, 2, and 3, as we see there. Now, if we were to calculate the net present value at 10%, we get these numbers. The offices are clearly the best investment. If we calculate the internal rate of return that makes all of those cash flows equal to 0, it looks like the shops one is the best one. Okay, so which one should we take, net present value or internal rate of return? And I think we need to consider how net present value and internal rate of return interplay. There's one other thing that we need to consider, and that's how much can we actually invest. I mean, look here, we've got offices, 15,000 units, 15,000 shops, 4,900. What if we've got 30,000 to invest? Do we need to deal with the fact that, hey, some capital is going to sit there idle? Or do we need to compare the entire set? Do we say, let's go with offices and units, that uses up to 30,000 we have to invest? Let's go with offices and shops, and hang on, we've got to stick the remaining 10,100 somewhere else. So what rate of return is that going to give us? So when you've got bundles, it becomes a little bit more complex. We're going to look at bundling a little later, but we're not going to get into the complexity of it. Okay, so if projects are mutually exclusive, in other words, you're not bundling, you're making a choice, we've got to take one, and when we take one, we are effectively giving up the other. So those projects that we just looked at, if you think about why they're giving you different internal rates of return, one reason may be that they simply have different risk, and that's why they've got a higher rate of return. So yes, you're getting a higher return, but having compensated for risk, that may be the rate of return you want to compensate for that risk. So what we've got here is a chart that really brilliantly compares net present value and internal rate of return. And I want to talk about this a little bit. And what net present value is giving you is it's basically saying, what's the value of this project at different discount rates? And it's pretty clear that the higher the discount rate you use, the more you're discounting down those future cash inflows usually, the lower the net present value. So both in the case of Project Blue and Project Green, the higher the discount rate we bring in, the lower the net present value becomes. Now it's clear that they're going to decrease at different rates. They're different projects. They have different timing of cash flows. So if we're increasing the discount rate, in other words, we're searching for an internal rate of return for a project. For Project Blue, we hit a net present value of 0 of 20%. That means that is its internal rate of return. But for Project Green, because of the timing of its cash flows, we've got to crank it all the way up to 25% to get that net present value down to 0. So what are our internal rates of return? For the green project, it's 25%. For the blue project, it's 20%. They're the rates of return that give us a 0 net present value. So by internal rate of return, the green project's the better one. But now let's look at it differently. Let's look at it from a net present value perspective. From a net present value perspective, you're not saying what rate of return gives you a 0 return. You're saying, at my cost of capital, at my real threshold interest rate, what's the value of this project? So if my threshold interest rate is 10%, and I discount all the cash flows at 10% for both Project Blue and Project Green, Project Blue's got most of its cash flows up front. They're probably not getting discounted as much, or they don't respond that much to changes in the interest rate, in the discount rate. So for lower discount rates, Project Blue is still giving you a higher net present value. You've got to push that discount rate pretty high for the two projects to basically be equal. And at 18% here, they're equal. But I think the way you need to approach this is to say it's extremely rare in real life to have two different interest rates that you're dealing with. You face a real interest rate. It's your real cost of funds. And that's the interest rate you should be using to evaluate your projects. And so using net present value here, and if your interest rate is 10%, it will tell you the blue project is best. If it's 20%, it will tell you the green project is best. Okay? It depends on what your cost of capital is. If you ignore your cost of capital and instead of saying, here's my cost of capital, I'm going to discount at that, and instead just look at the return implicit in the project, and that might be compensating for risk, that's not going to give you the big picture. That's not going to assess the project against your benchmark. And your benchmark is what you're paying for funds. So internal rate of return excludes that. It excludes consideration of the cost. And just because you can come up with a discount rate using the internal rate of return calculation doesn't mean that it is sensible for making decisions. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear that what we want to be using is we want to be using net present value because it identifies the most valuable projects in all your circumstances, taking into account your cost of capital. And because it takes into account your cost of capital, it specifically measures the enhancement in wealth that the project is generating for the business. Now, there is this thing called the present value index, sometimes called the profitability index. And this basically takes net present value calculations. And what it does is it takes the future cash flows and it divides them by the original investment. Okay, so it's sort of a way of saying instead of taking off the original cash flow, let's divide by that cash flow. So if the profitability index is greater than 1, then the thing is worth investing in. So that gives you a profitability index. Now, why is the profitability index 228? Because the net present value is 28,000. That's after you've taken off the 200,000. So the cash flows that must be coming in, the present value of the future cash flows is 228. When you take off the 200, you come up with a net present value of 28,000. So sometimes that's used to rank projects, but it's not necessarily going to give you the best net present value project. This is just a ranking mechanism. If the projects involve the same investment, and that's the amount of funds you had. But to be honest, you're calculating net present value to get it anyway. So you may as well use net present value to make the decisions. Okay, now what we're going to do next is we're going to talk about capital rationing, and then we'll look at different lives of projects. So let's say that you've got a business, and this is realistic, you've got a situation where you've got a limited amount of capital to allocate, and you've got to allocate it to different projects. So either this is a decision made internally, so you've got only a certain amount of resources allocated to you by top management, and that's all you can use. Or alternatively, the markets, investors simply aren't going to give you any more funds, hard capital rationing. Okay, so if you've got limited capital, you're trying to maximize wealth. The projects you take matter. It's how do you decide which projects to take? We're not going to get really sophisticated here, and what we're going to see is actually common sense. Let's say the project, a company has got 6 projects, total cash outlay of 1.6 million, or rather that's how much they could spend if they invested in all of them, but they've got a budget constraint of 600,000. That's all they can invest in. They've got no more available. So here we've got the projects, A, B, C, D, E, and F. And look, they've got different amounts of money. Now, to be honest, this is just an optimization process. Basically, say we've got $600,000 to spend. It's pretty clear that we can't take E and F because that goes too much. So maybe we could take one of the 400s and one of the 200s. So what's the best 400? It's E. Once we've chosen the best 400, what's the best 200 we can get to match with that? D. So 45 plus 35, what's that going to give us? 80 if we take D and E. So that's basically taking a 400 and a 200, because we can't take two 400s, and saying we'll get 80. What if we would take 300s? Is there a combination of three 200s? Is there a combination of 3 200s that will give us better than 80? And actually, yes, there is. I think if you take, let's say you take D, because that's a 200 that's giving you almost the same as E, right? It's a pretty good 200. So let's say you take D. you'd take the next one, which I guess is A. So already you've got a return of 63. And if you added B to that, you'd have 83. So if you added A to that, yeah, so if you had A, B, and D, those three 200s would give you a better rate of return, a better return than taking D and E. So really this is a question of looking at different combinations and working out which combination is giving you the best return. So there's our return, and there's our answer, A, B, and D. A, B, and D, the three 200s. Okay, and there's no combination that's going to give you a higher net present value. Okay, so what we'll do next time is we'll go on to talk about investment projects with unequal lives, so unequal periods over which they're going to generate benefits.